to have with us Guido Sandleris. Guido now is a professor of economics at Johns Hopkins and Universidad de Itela. He used to be the governor of the Central Bank of Argentina for the last 2 years of the Macri administration. Before that, he was the Undersecretary of Economic Policy for the Federal Ministry of Finance. Before that, for the province of Buenos Aires, he was the Undersecretary of Finance as well. And before that, he was undertaking his academic career, but then he took this detour into economic policy. And now he's one of the macroeconomists in Argentina, both at academia and thinking about alternative paths to basically put Argentina back into a growth and sustainability trajectory. And today he's going to talk to us about first, what is behind Argentina's economic malaise, maybe some ideas on how to turn things around in the next decade. So with that, I mean, thanks Guido for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Vale, for the presentation. Yes. Hi, thanks everybody for coming. Okay, and how do I? If it's better, I stay there. Perfect. Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's move ahead. 3 parts in today's presentation. The idea is to talk for roughly half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we open up the floor for questions. Some perspective on the Argentine economy, an analysis of what the current administration has been doing, same old recipe, same poor results, and then looking forward, can Argentina achieve economic stability and inclusive growth? So some perspective, if we look at the last 5 decades, the last 50 years, we see that in terms of growth, the performance of Argentina has been very poor. And this is not, in the first column, we have the last 50 years stopping right before the pandemic, so that in order not to contaminate the data with that. But then you can have the same data for every decade. And what you see is that consistently in the whole period, and almost in every single decade, Argentina's economic growth has been one of the smallest in the region. Only Venezuela did worse than Argentina over the last 50 years. And this is particularly bad because we are not talking about the region of the world that has been doing amazingly in terms of growth. If you look at the world, Latin America has been the region where growth has been lagging compared to other regions of the world. So Argentina has been doing poorly in a neighborhood that has been doing poor. Let's move to the next one. And the cumulative effect of not doing well in terms of growth has a huge impact over time. What this graph shows is if Argentina had, instead of its growth, now the number is slightly different. It was 0.7 before, it was in local currency. This is in real dollars. If we started in 1970 with the GDP of Argentina, and instead of having the growth path that Argentina had, that's the red line, we had the average path of Latin American economies. Well, growth, GDP would have been almost twice as high. If instead of growing 0.2%, Argentina had been growing like the average of the world, well, it will have exactly almost twice the per capita GDP. If Argentina had grown like Chile, the country that grew faster in the region in these last 50 years, well, it's going to be 2.5 times almost the GDP per capita. So these like little percentage points that you lose of growth every year, this crisis every decade that Argentina has, have a huge impact over time in terms of the quality of life of people. The other dimension that I like to look at in order to assess the macroeconomic performance of a country, one is growth, the other one is inflation. It tells you a lot of what's going on. If we look at the last now 54 years until 1970 till the present, roughly in almost half of those years, the Argentine economy was in a recession. Okay, I'm emphasizing this long period of time because this is a problem that is not just one administration responsible. It's been many, many years of the Argentine economy not doing well. So half of the years almost in recession, 39 of the last 54 years with an inflation higher than 20%. In every single year, we had an inflation higher than 20% since 2009. And there were only 8 years in which something that tends to happen every single year in most countries of the world, which is achieving positive growth and low inflation, not very low, like less than 10%. That is, you look at Australia, it had in the last 50 years, roughly, it had that 48 of the last. You look at most countries in the world, and that's often the rule. In Argentina, it has been an exception. Only 8 of the last 54 years, Argentina had positive GDP growth and inflation below 10%. And none of those years happened in almost the last 20 years. So that's pretty bad. And without going into all the details, if I have to tell you very briefly what's behind this superb macroeconomic performance of Argentina, I would say the problem is fiscal. We can go beyond that and try to assess, okay, why Argentina has been unable to achieve a reasonable fiscal performance, a balanced budget over time. Like, but let me, and then we would have to talk about political, historical, sociological reasons. Let me skip that, and let me just focus on what happened, which was last 54 years, only 6, with overall budget surplus, 13 years with primary budget surplus, none in the last decade and a half. So it's clear that this consistent fiscal deficit has generated some impacts in the Argentine economy. I would argue that the recurrent crises that the Argentine economy has are very much related to. Because usually when you have a deficit, you have to, not usually, always when you have a deficit, you have to finance it. And you can finance it borrowing from abroad, borrowing in your domestic markets, or using monetary financing from the central. So if you look at, since the 70s till the present, every administration, we can easily, by just looking at the budget constraint of the government and saying, okay, how this administration financed the deficit that it didn't cover. It was, the main source of financing was monetary, we ended up with much higher inflation or hyperinflation. If it was foreign borrowing, we ended up in a sovereign default. It's been like almost like mathematically. You look how they don't correct the deficit, they finance it somehow. If the deficit doesn't converge to an equilibrium quickly, then you end up in a crisis. Argentina has been unable to build the credibility that has allowed other countries to run a budget deficit. What you can not do is run a budget deficit and not have a consistent source of genuine financing. If you have built your credibility as a government, as a country, then you can run budget deficit many years in a row, and you will have a consistent base of investors that will finance. Argentina didn't build that credibility, was unable to do it, but nonetheless ran the budget deficit. The consequence was this recurrent crisis. And to make things worse, when we look at what happened in the last 20 years, we see that there was a period between 2003 and 2015 where the increase in government spending has been insane. Under the Néstor Kirchner first and Cristina Fernández de Kirchner afterwards administration, the government spending, national, provincial levels, the ratio of that to GDP basically doubled. It went from 22% of GDP to 41.5% in 2015. If we look at the period prior to Kirchner, we see that on average, it has been around 20-something%. It's true that having 20-something% over these years didn't mean that Argentina did well on growth and inflation. But now things have become, because we still, with the lower spending, we still had the deficit. But clearly having a much higher level of public spending makes the situation even worse, even more difficult. In 2015, Macri's administration came in with this diagnosis. I was part of that team, and we tried to correct the budget deficit and this increase in government spending. And government spending in terms of GDP declined in those 4 years from 41.5% to 36.2%, with mistakes, maybe too slowly. But it did happen, and decreasing spending has one problem, politically speaking, which is it doesn't make you popular. Spending more makes you popular. Spending less makes you unpopular. It's as simple as that. That government was not reelected, and first, due to some government decisions, and then due to the pandemic, the current administration increased again public spending. Of course, the peak there in 2020 is associated to the pandemic, but still today, we are at the level of government spending to GDP almost 2 percentage points above where it was in 2019. The consequence of all this has been an economy, as I said, I show it first every decade, but if we look at GDP per capita, basically the level of GDP per capita in Argentina this year is going to be exactly the same where it was in 2006. So it's been basically a generation almost where the welfare as measured with all the problems that it might have by the GDP per capita didn't improve. One more, please. And the consequence is that with that, together with the high inflation, that Argentina now has roughly 40% of its population living under the poverty line. And if you look at the young population, kids under 15 years old, it's well over half of the population living under poverty. The summary for me of these couple of slides is that as it is working now, we cannot continue living like this. Like the macroeconomy of Argentina cannot continue to be handled in this way. Okay? Because the results have been awful. So we need a change. Let's talk about what the current administration did. So this has been a constant, I would say, both under Cristina Fernández de Kirchner and under Alberto Fernández de Kirchner. If you ask them what their economic plan is, well, Alberto Fernández said, we don't have it. We don't believe in those things of plan. Insane. But if as an analyst, you have to say, well, what was the plan? Basically, and I remember from conversations I had with some members of his team prior to them becoming government, the plan was basically, let's Macri reduce public spending too much, we can increase it. And of course, we won't have access to international credit markets, but we can finance it with the central bank, given that they have all these like capital constraints that prevent people from buying foreign currency. And what that generates is, for a short period of time, higher disposable income. We call it in Argentina, plan platita, like a little extra money in your pocket. And that generates a short-lived boosting growth. Following the pandemic, the recovery, the rebound of the Argentine economy was strong. In a year, basically, it was at the level where it was in the year before the pandemic. It grew last year by 5%. So it fell by 10% in the pandemic, recovered 10% the year after, and 5% extra last year. What is the problem with that kind of government spending full growth? is that it's unsustainable. It generates inflation and pressures on the FX. And the government, both under Cristina and under Alberto Fernandez, in order to address that problem, use a lot of, I'm going to call it palliative measures. The CEPO becoming, capital controls becoming stronger and stronger, restricting imports because the central bank was losing reserves. In order to prevent higher inflation, they would use the nominal exchange rate as an anchor, and therefore Argentina would become less and less competitive. They would freeze utility prices, so gas, electricity would be relatively cheaper, and therefore that would push for a while inflation down. But all these things are unsustainable. And when we look at where we are going to be after 4 years of this administration, basically, this administration inherited a fiscal deficit of primary fiscal deficit of 0.4%. Macri's administration received a deficit that the official figure was 3.8, but there were a number of things that we call them skeletons, like hidden expenditures that have been not paid, that would increase that number to something close to 5%. But let's say that it received somewhere between 4 or 5%. The Macri administration reduced the fiscal deficit, albeit slowly at the beginning. And then, okay, forget about the year of the pandemic. But thereafter, this administration has consistently had a fiscal deficit of 3% of GDP. We think this year is going to be 3.5%. Remember that the target in the IMF program is 1.9%. And the financing has been, as I said, mostly monetary financing, some local government debt as well. But if you add up these 4 columns, basically you achieve almost the same number as the sum of the primary fiscal deficit. And the consequences of this way of thinking about the economic policy, about trying to achieve an extra point of growth in the short term at the expense of doing inconsistent and sustainable things, are pretty bad. Let's start looking at the concept. First, soaring inflation. Last year, inflation was close to 100%. Next year is going to be, sorry, not next year. This year is going to be almost 120%. If, I'm going to say it, quote unquote, if things go well, if it could be much worse if the government, for some reason, were to lose the control of the nominal value. That would be the highest inflation since the year 1990, since the hyperinflation. Second consequence, the FX gap. Whenever you put all this exchange rate control, a parallel exchange rate appears, and the blue chips, the gap between the blue chip swap and the official exchange rate has been, during this administration, consistently around 100%. In the middle, they have like 3 currency runs. And recently, we have been seeing the blue chip exchange rate relatively stable, but inflation accelerating. So the real exchange rate has been appreciated, which puts even more pressure on the reserve. Yes. Third consequence is, I told you, as a palliative measure, because this huge gap in the, let's go back to the previous one first. This, I said, these policies generate a huge gap between the official and the parallel exchange. And that generates a lot of perverse incentives. Importers are desperate to get those subsidized dollars from the central bank and import stuff from private planes for the board of the company at roughly half the market price, because the official exchange rate is half the value of what something like the parallel exchange rate would be, which we can think of as a kind of a market price, to exporters being less willing to export because the tax on the export, beyond the export tariff, the tax generated by these exchange rate differentials is huge. A consequence of importers trying to get dollars like crazy and exporters trying not to get rid of their dollars is the central bank losing reserves every year. In order to make that process slower, the CEPO camp, the capital controls camp, that initially I was at the central bank when we had to put them in, because the new following the primary elections, the new administration basically was saying, this is what we are going to do. And in economics, we know that when something is expected, it has consequences now. And in order to, if the next administration was going to do it, well, we were kind of forced to do it to avoid worse consequences. So, but the CEPO that we put in place was something very simple. Basically, importers could import whatever they want. The gap between the blue chip swap that now is like 100% was always less than 20%. So the perverse incentives were not that relevant. And there were not more rules than a restriction on the amount of dollars that people could buy to sell. When we look at the FX regime now, this is a Frankenstein, okay? We could spend the rest of this talk, the next 35 minutes, explaining how this works and the amount of different exchange rate we had. So this is, sorry, it's in Spanish, but it was too long to translate. So, so this is the effects. And then you have the official one, the informal one. Then you have official exchange rate, but by sector. So we have $1 for the soy producers that export, that now there is a new edition that they're not only by sector, but for a certain period of time, a month, 3 months. So we have the dollar agro. We have a dollar that is called dollar Coldplay, because there was part of the import is cheap to bring foreign bonds to play in Argentina, because basically the central bank is subsidizing half of the value. So Coldplay, I think that had like in Brazil 4 dates for concert. In Argentina it had 12. We have less population by far than Brazil and less purchasing power. But it was so attractive to get these guys. And also it was, they created a dollar for following that episode for foreign bonds. Then we had the dollar, we call it Qatar, because when you go abroad and you pay with your credit card, kind of, there are some taxes, but it was subsidized. So they had to put more and more taxes on that, because everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people were finding attractive traveling abroad, because the government with this cap is subsidizing part of your expenses. We could continue for a long time, but basically this is how it works. And then there are a lot of restrictions on if you, for example, buy in the parallel exchange rate, in the official legal, sorry, not the official, the legal parallel exchange rate, then you cannot buy in the official market for imports. If you have a subsidy in the consumption of gas, you cannot buy. It's a mess of restriction of what you could do. So this is another consequence of this kind of macroeconomic policy thinking and making. Yes. Fourth consequence, I said it, the central bank basically with this kind of regime runs out of reserves. When we left, when I left the central bank in December 2019, I left something close to $13 billion in net reserves owned by the central bank. That number is, as of 3 days ago, last official data, $1 billion. $1 billion, just to give some dimension for this, is roughly less than a week of Argentine imports. Okay, you have a coverage of reserves to imports of less than a week. Of course, the headline number is gross reserves. We talk about 30-something billion dollars. I used to talk about that number too, central bank. But there are part of that number that, of those reserves, that you cannot use them freely, or they are not there to be used freely. They are called swaps. There's a swap with the Chinese government, with the BIS. Then, if you take that away, the liquid reserves will be 13 billion, but a large part of that are not owned by the central bank, but are the backing of the dollar deposits of the people at the banks. So that's roughly $12 billion. So what is left is $1 billion of own reserves. And this month, before the end of April, Argentina has to pay $1.4 billion to the Fed. So this means basically that the central bank, by the end of this month, will run out of reserves. One more. And all this that I'm describing, all this disastrous situation, is not the result, let me emphasize it, of a very bad economic context. It's not that this government had a lot of bad luck. It's not that. Argentina had, during this administration, record terms of trade. Okay, the value of Argentina's exports relative to the value of or the price of Argentina's exports relative to the price of Argentine imports have never been as high as they are now. Okay. In the meantime, the fund gave away like $4.5 billion to Argentina and to most countries in the world because they increased their capital. The pandemic was bad for everybody, and that was very difficult for every country in the world. But when we look at the macroeconomic context after that, it has been a relatively favorable macroeconomic context. This is just for you to look. This, below 400, was the average soy price under Macri's administration. 600 is the average price under Alberto Fernandez's administration, 50% higher. Yes, one. Thank you. And in this context, something else happened this year, which is the drought. So an economy that was hanging on a thread gets hit by a negative real shock. A drought, yes. That basically implies a 40% reduction almost on the soy harvest, which is one of the main agricultural exports of Argentina. In terms of value, this implies that agricultural exports that last year were $42 billion now are going to be something close to $25 billion. So a $17 billion decline in agricultural exports. One more. Let me emphasize this. I want to give some perspective. So the drought we saw in the previous graph is bad. And it's worse than other droughts we had recently. It's slightly worse in terms of the impact in the volume of production than the drought that we had in 2018 when we were in government. This year, the decline in the volume of production is going to be something closer to 40%. In our case, was 30%. But remember what I said about the price, the terms of trade and the price of Argentine exports. This year, even with the drought, the production of soy, the value of the production of soy in dollars is very similar to a normal year without a drought, but with normal prices. So this graph shows this. If we look at prices of 2019, last year of Macri's administration, and the production of soy of last year, a year without drought, well, it was $14 billion. This year with the drought, but with super high prices, it's almost $14 billion. So let's not lose perspective. For sure, the drought is a huge catastrophe for the Argentine agricultural sector and for the Argentine economy. But in terms of macroeconomic performance, what they are having is they were incredibly lucky, or the government was incredibly lucky with the prices these last 2 years. And now, of course, they didn't save anything. And now they were hit by a negative real shock that put to this year's crop harvest a similar level to what we had in regular years. Okay. This was what I was saying. By the end of the month, the consequence of when we project what the net reserves are going to be, by the end of the month, the central bank is going to run out of reserves. In 2 months, it will have probably minus $4 billion of reserves. What this means is that, so you cannot have minus $4 billion. Don't take this as the projection. What this means is they will have to take new measures. Okay, because basically the only way in which they can gather dollars would be to use the dollar of the deposit. That's extremely risky of the because they back the deposits of the people. So the dollar deposit of the people. So I guess they will not do that, or they will do that to a limited amount. Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner did it for approximately $1.5 billion in 2015. I doubt that they will go beyond that. So they will need to take other measures. Some we are seeing this dollar higher, a higher dollar for soy exports, for other regional exports, more restrictions on imports. All that has have an impact. So when we, please, when we project what's going to happen this year is basically what I was saying at the beginning: 120% inflation, a collapse of the GDP of by 4%. And again, this 4%. So 2 days ago, the fund came up with their own projection this year. They say 0.2 positive growth. I think they are crazy. That they have been, even that correction is so much lagging behind what's going on that is crazy. So, and 4% is not excessive. Basically, 4% is the agricultural sector having an output that falls by almost 25%. That's more or less what we saw in the soy harvest. A little bit more was the soy harvest. A 25% collapse in the agricultural sector, and a 2% decline in output for the rest of the economy. That means basically that for 4%, the rest of the economy remains at the level that it had in December last year, because the statistical carryover is that. And zero international research. So now we arrive to the last part of the presentation. Can Argentina achieve economic stability and inclusive growth after all these depressing figures? Basically, what I show you so far is the last 50 years have been a disaster, and the last 4 have been even worse. And so it's not very optimistic what I had said so far. So let me give you 2 more slides of depressing news, and then we move to the hope. Okay? Let me do it like that. So the first one is, let me assess for a second the current attempt at stabilizing the economy. The current attempt at stabilizing the economy started with the IMF program signed at the end of 2021, early 2022, when Guzman was the finance minister. The initial impulse didn't work very well. We had a crisis, a financial crisis, a couple of months after the agreement was signed, basically because the government signed the agreement and didn't change the behavior. Government spending continued increasing, monetary financing continued increasing. At some point, the markets that were hoping for the IMF to limit that behavior realized that the IMF was doing not much. The agreement was not being fulfilled. And we had a crisis in the middle of last year that basically generated the resignation of 2 finance ministers in a month, Guzman first, Batakis, and then Sergio Massa came in. He corrected initially for a couple of months the pattern of government spending. It lasted no more than a couple of months, and it wasn't really a genuine correction of government spending, but a lot of tricks. It was a bag full of tricks that work for less and less time at a time, non-genuine correction. But the program entails some disbursement of funds. This column is slightly larger than this one last year, so that's some disbursement of funds for Argentina, more or less equivalent to the SDR allocation during the program. So the lending or the Argentines' position against the IMF became more negative, more debt in last year. This year is more or less balanced between payments that Argentina has to make and disbursements of the IMF. The results of the program have been a complete failure of a dimension that I haven't seen recently in IMF program. Basically, not even nothing was achieved. Things were made worse. Okay, let's look at a couple of data. So these first 2 are the key targets in almost any IMF program. Now, I'm okay with saying all these things because Alex is not part of the fund. I'm not being unpolite by complaining. But the primary fiscal deficit, when we finished the market administration, was 0.4% of GDP. At the end of 2021, it was 3% of GDP. This year, the projections put it at 3.5% of GDP. So basically, since the program started, the GDP has become larger, or are going to become larger. Net reserves at the end of 2021, when the program was signed, they were 2 billion. There were 13 billion when we left on December 10th. If they don't do something, if they continue along the current path, it's going to be 5 billion negative. Inflation is going to be almost 2 or 3 times as higher as it was, not only when we left, but also when the current program began. And at the same time, one can say, well, maybe they couldn't correct the targets, but the outcomes were good. No, inflation was a disaster, growth is a disaster. But they are doing structural reforms. No, the program had 0 structural reform. It was a 0 ambitious program. And nonetheless, it had only made things worse. So, one more, we need a new stabilization strategy. This has been a disaster. And the policy, this Kirchner's idea that you spend the government spends its way towards growth, in Argentina, it doesn't work. It doesn't work anywhere. You have to build, as I said, the credibility first. Without that, it will never work. So I think that a key element for any new administration that wants to change the recent macroeconomic failures of Argentina has to be anchored on a new fiscal strategy. If we don't correct this problem of this very high government spending and consistent fiscal deficits, we are going to end up having crisis after crisis like it has been in the last decades. So I think that the new administration will have to be very aggressive from the beginning on the fiscal front and very prudent on the monetary and FX front. I would say, in that sense, almost exactly the opposite strategy as the one that was pursued under Macri's administration. At that time, for a number of reasons, the fiscal approach was, remember, gradually. There were a lot of political constraints, minority in Congress, concerns associated with the fact that there has never been, until Macri presidency, a president elected democratically that was not Peronist, that managed to finish his or her term. Macri was the first one to achieve that. So there were a lot of concerns that limited, I think, what the government under Macri's administration did on the fiscal front. Of course, there were mistakes. I'm always very, we have to learn from the mistakes. We don't have to be dogmatic. So on the fiscal front, we need to go much faster. And I think that the other thing that happened under Macri's administration is that from the beginning, it was too risky and ambitious, the monetary and FX regime put in place, because it relied very heavily on the fiscal part going well. And the fiscal part has been the Achilles heel of the Argentine economy. So it was kind of over-optimistic to assume that you could put in place a regime that would only work well or would otherwise expose you to huge risk if the fiscal was done well. So I think we have to do the opposite this time. The anchor has to be fiscal, and then the monetary and the FX can follow, but it cannot be the other way around. And the key is going to be lower government spending. Taxes are already very high. The public sector here, the problem is that the public sector has become a backpack that is too heavy for the private sector. There is no way that with this level of government spending, the private sector of Argentina can grow and become the engine of growth. So taxes have to go low, have to become lower. But you cannot do that at the beginning because that generates more deficit. You need to lower spending first. The Frankenstein cepo has to go away immediately, okay? There is no way the economy can act or behave normally with this mess of regulations that change every month. But this doesn't mean that you will be able to get rid of all the exchange rate controls. Some prudential exchange rate controls might be needed at the beginning because the amount of pesos in the economy are too large compared to the amount of international reserves that we are having. But the Frankenstein cepo has to go. We have to build something more rational. And there has to be a very clear rule in terms of no more monetary financing. We did it in the last year and a half when I was at the central bank, and we need to do it again. That's the only way, that together with independence of the central bank, to be able to lower inflation consistently. And we have to use a mix of orthodox and heterodox instruments to achieve a decline of inflation that is as fast as possible, but it has to be anchored on the fiscal front. So let me stop there for a second on the macroeconomic. We tend to do too much of this part because it has been the key aspect of Argentina's, I would say, macroeconomic problems. But there is light at the end of this tunnel. And I think this stabilization process as a bridge to a better place. And there are many reasons, not a thing that we could say that if some points may be in recent decades, but yes, nowadays, there are many reasons to be optimistic. If we manage to stabilize the macroeconomy, to correct this imbalance, there are many reasons to think that Argentina might have ahead of itself many years of growth. Let me give you some examples. There are some sectors that have huge potential. Our usual suspect is agriculture. But if we look at fishery, lithium, gas and oil, let me give you some numbers in terms of, so I'm focusing on natural resources. But this is not limited to that. Argentina has nowadays the second largest reserves of shale gas in the world. Okay? In red is shale oil, we are the fourth. In blue is shale gas. It's not oil gas, not all the gas or all the oil. It's only the one produced under this shale process. The key there is Vaca Muerta. We didn't have that a couple of years. Yeah, one more. Just to give some dimension, comparing like traditional oil and gas reserves with the shale oil and gas reserves, put Argentina, this is according to a publication by the US Institute of Energy, basically. What it says is, in blue, we have proved reserves. There is always an issue on how you compare proved reserves with, let me call them recoverable reserves, as they do, as potential reserve. We don't know for sure how many barrels of oil or the amount of gas we can get out of Vaca Muerta. But this is according to projections. So what, basically, if we look at gas, Argentina would have, considering the conventional and the shale, will be among the top 5 gas producers in the world in a period of time where having a safe source for energy has become key following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What has prevented Argentina from exporting some of the gas that is getting out of Vaca Muerta? We don't have the pipelines to move the gas from Vaca Muerta to a harbor. Okay? The first pipeline is going to be built it's going to be finished between this year and the next one. Argentina won't be able to export much from that because that pipeline will go from Vaca Muerta to a place called Saliqueló. And that is enough to be able to pump the gas into the network of Argentina. So a lot of the imports of gas that Argentina has not to do will not be needed. Okay, and even it could export a little bit, some technical stuff needs to be solved, but export through that pipeline to maybe Chile and Bolivia, and eventually Brazil. But we could, if we build a second pipeline that goes somewhere close to Bahia Blanca, we could export that gas to the world. Okay, at a time where a key exporter of gas like Russia has been deemed not a trustworthy supplier for many. With oil reserves, to say, well, Argentina saying, look, among the top 15 countries in the world in terms of oil reserves. So this is something that was not there a couple of years ago. And I think that there is a lot of potential. If we go, yeah, please. This is the expected reduction of imports already a little bit this year, but mostly next year as a result of this year is related to price, not so much to the pipeline. But next year, we will have the effect of the pipeline playing in our favor. Yes. This is lithium. Argentina has the second largest reserves of lithium in the world. Lithium is used for the production of certain like chips. In terms of lithium production, Argentina now ranks 4th in the world. Australia produces 10 times more lithium than Argentina with less reserves of lithium, much smaller. The size of the circle gives you an idea of how much could be produced. So we are lagging behind. We need to have the regulation in place that would allow us to attract investment for lithium. Yes, one more. Mining exports. This drives me crazy and probably, you know, have you ever seen this map where you see the lights in North Korea and the lights in South Korea at night? And you say, well, you compare the two regimes and say, obviously, there is one that has been better at generating growth and wealth. If you look at the Andes mountains that separate Chile and Argentina, you have a similar experience. The same mountain, basically, okay? I'm not a geologist, especially, but roughly it's the same mountain. Half of the mountain is Chile and half of the mountain is Argentina. Chile exports $55 billion in copper, silver, gold. Argentina exports 5. You look at many mountains and it's full of mines producing in Chile, nothing on the Argentine side. These things need to change. We need to create legal frameworks that allow investment in this sector. Yes. And beyond that, I said, this is not just natural resources. Despite this insane macroeconomy, Argentina has had some, in the knowledge economy, some amazing success stories. Probably the better known one is Mercado Libre, Globant, Out Zero, Walla, more recently. There are many sectors where Argentina can generate growth. So I wanted to use, let me stop here. I wanted to use these final minutes to show you that there is hope. We need to just correct the recurrent macroeconomic imbalances, but then there is a lot of potential. Let me stop here. Thank you very much, Alex. Questions? Just for you. Thank you very much.
I mean, maybe to put into context, I mean, some of the things that Guido said. I mean, when he was talking about international reserves, and he said that when he left the Central Bank of Argentina, Argentina had $12 billion in international reserves. Even that is extremely low. So when you look at Latin American countries today, Chile has $50 billion. It's a much smaller economy than Argentina. Colombia also has $50 billion. Brazil has $300 billion, even more than that. So maybe to compare, I mean, Argentina has all these opportunities, and you can synthesize a little bit the challenges on the macro side that Guido was highlighting. Maybe to run the Argentinian economy, macroeconomy, the way that Chile is managing its macroeconomy, you might need $100 billion, I mean, in the long term, but to have an open capital account, a floating exchange rate, that's a little bit the type of challenge on the macro side, if you want to quantify it, that Argentina also will need to build in terms of resilience and be able to handle these shocks. I mean, he was telling you that, I mean, now Argentina is hanging by a thread, facing a $17 billion shock. Colombia faced maybe a much larger shock when the price of oil collapsed in 2014, 2015. I think 6 percentage points of GDP. And well, the Colombian peso depreciated. They had a significant slowdown of their economy. They never ran to Washington to ask and beg for money and for to plead for solidarity, etc. They just manage a negative macro shock by running a more counter-cyclical fiscal policy, etc. The economy ran into a significant slowdown, but then it picked up, and it was like a normal business cycle for an emerging market that is subject to large commodity prices. And that's eventually where Argentina needs to be if some of these things are actually implemented, but it's a very hard challenge for the future. So with that, I think we can open it up for questions from the audience.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Sanderlis. My name is Cody Etlin. I work at the State Department, but I went to SAIS, and I'm an avid follower of all things Argentina. My question is, assuming that there is an opposition figure that wins the presidential elections, whether that's Larreta or Bullrich, focusing kind of on the fiscal front, what would be on the chopping block per se, if there were an aggressive kind of quasi-shock approach?
So there is an obvious candidate, no? There is a lot of, let me put it this way. When you look at the government spending in the region, the average in terms of GDP is roughly 26%. Argentina, as I said, is now spending roughly 38% of GDP. Argentina's public sector spends like Scandinavian countries, but provides the services of Argentina. And that talks a lot about misallocation of resources. There is one obvious thing that in this, I will have to agree with some of the things that finally, after many years, this government has been trying to do, which is a country with more than 50% poverty in kids cannot subsidize energy consumption for the rich, okay? And if I have to pick one thing that too late, but that this government is trying to do that makes some sense, that makes sense. That's a policy we need to continue, and the amount of subsidies is more than 2% of GDP now, and that's a place where this government has to make more progress, and we have to continue on that front. And then there are many areas, like we say, there is something that I believe deeply on this, which is on the Excel sheet, when you produce an economic plan, it's easy to make these numbers. But the difference between saying, I would like to do something and really having a plan in terms of an economy in the economy is whether it's politically feasible and sustainable or not. So for me, the key, given what I see in terms of people, how upset people are with the current situation, I think that the new government will have a mandate to correct this macroeconomic imbalance, which Macri's administration didn't have a mandate. Now it's been many years of high inflation, no growth. The people are tired and upset. So that is going to play in favor. But as I said before, cutting expenditures doesn't make you popular. I think that the new administration will have to make a lot of, let me call them, symbolic gestures. If politicians are not able to show that they are also cutting on the stuff that is relevant for them, it's not going to be possible to implement expenditure cuts that are needed. That is going to be key. Although it's wishful thinking to believe that just by cutting the number of advisors in Congress, you can reduce its deficit. The numbers don't add up, but it has to be done. You cannot ask again people to put some effort and sacrifice, pay more for gas, for electricity, if the political system doesn't do a huge effort.
Hi, Guido. My question is focused on the monetary side. Of course, the fiscal side is relevant, but on the monetary side, what are you thinking for the next administration should approach? I mean, you talked about combining orthodox and heterodox policies. Are we talking about a new monetary regime, changing the currency? Are we talking about, there's been some politicians talking about dollarization, and also how is, this is more academic, but your opinion on this recent view that inflation could also be conflict, you know, Ivan's paper, and how Argentina should tackle that challenge.
So it has many topics, your question. Let me start with dollarization. I don't think it's the best solution for Argentina. There is a long, we can make the theoretical case of why it's not the best solution. Usually what the literature tells you is that when you peg yourself to a currency, you are adopt the currency of a foreign country, basically you are adopting their monetary policy as well. So it would be a good thing to do so if the shocks that hit that economy are similar to the shocks that hit your economy. If not, you will have the monetary policy maybe amplified instead of smoothing them out. Of course, it's tempting because inflation is so high. We have been such a failure in terms, as in the last 50 years, in terms of achieving low inflation. They say, let's do anything. But I think that when we look at the countries that have dollarized, what in the region, it seems to be that it's not the best. They are, it can be done better. We can do better. Then there is a practical aspect, how you do it, given that you don't have reserve. No? It might, trying to dollarize the economy right away, it might entail a huge, in practice, hyperinflation. That's something that you usually want to avoid because the consequences in terms of poverty are huge. So I don't think it's the best regime. I, on purpose, didn't spend, although I was a central bank, I didn't spend a long time in this presentation talking about the monetary or FX regime. And I emphasize much more the fiscal. And I tell you why, because I am convinced that if we don't address what is called technically the fiscal dominance, this phenomenon where the government runs a deficit and then the central bank finances it, and therefore monetary policy becomes endogenous to what the treasury is doing. If we don't address that, there is, it doesn't matter which monetary regime you put in place, it's not going to work. Okay, it might work for a short period of time and then it's going to collapse. We have been in Argentina extremely correct in terms of the amount of regimes we have put in place. If some of you have lived in Argentina from the accent I hear it, and the fact that you're here, you have lived through so many exchange rate regimes in your life that a Swiss student, one seeing generation, lives, we have inflation targeting, monetary rate targeting. It's insane the amount of things we tried. It never worked. And the reason why it doesn't work is fiscal. That's why we need to focus on what I think is first order of magnitude in terms of importance, that's the fiscal. If that is done well, there are many monetary and exchange rate regimes that can lower inflation. That's my take. Regarding Ivan's paper, Ivan is a fantastic economist, a very good friend, but I haven't read his paper yet. I'm not gonna come.
Thank you, Guido, for being here. I'm Florence. I'm from Argentina, actually. And I did live all these things that he's talking about. So basically, I did my undergrad in Argentina, and then I moved here in 2019 when actually Macri was about to finish his mandate. And this sounds like very real, you know, the whole presentation and everything. And I think it's great, all the ideas that you have and the hope that I think was the same message that Macri gave at the time, you know, the hope of changing something in the economic, in the Argentinian economy. However, I think that there are some things that I would like you to address in the sense of like how the lack of education of Argentina, because you talk about 50% of poverty there, how that is gonna affect any kind of decisions that you will take if, you know, Macri comes, well, Macri or anyone in like Burrich or whoever is there, comes back to the government, how is that gonna impact those people? And on top of that, how do you think that all these things can be applied in a 4-year term, which I think is a very short term to change the macroeconomic perspective? That I think is something that happened on the previous Monday, that 4 years was too short to be able to change something. And then my last question is, how do you think politicians should take into account, you know, think more about the country itself and not that much about them as for politicians to be like reelected on the 4 years?
Okay. It's kind of many topics, no? But it's interesting. So let me talk for a second about education. That was one of the topics you raised, and it's good that you raised that topic. I think it's key because I tried to do it at the end a little bit, talking about the potential that Argentina has. One of the frustrating things about Argentina is that we seem to be discussing all the time the same stuff, the stuff we cannot solve and that is hurting us more immediately, which is the macroeconomy. I remember when I was at the central bank. So governors of central bank go every 2 months to a place called Basel in Switzerland. That's where the BIS is. And so governors of central banks all over the world meet there every 2 months and talk about the economy, and about monetary policy, and about, sometimes I call it like the self-help group for central bankers. We say, why is the media so mean to us? And then we all talk and discuss it. And we also talk about economic situation. And one of the things that was kind of shocking for me at the time, like 4 years ago, was that most countries in the world had very low inflation. And their problem, if we can call that a problem, was how do we get to the 2% target, given that we are at 0.5% inflation? Now, of course, for me, the answer was easy. You know, like, we did very well on that front. We were too well, too poorly. No, now, due to the policy response to the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, things have changed a little bit in the world, and inflation has become an issue as well. But sometimes in Argentina, we are discussions of that the world has solved many years ago or decades ago. And when you look at what the world is discussing, is how is the workforce going to address technological innovations like artificial intelligence? How are we going to have a better work-free time balance? What do we do with the education if we want the next generation to live better than ours? All those discussions have basically remained muted in Argentina as a result of the difficulty in addressing the economic balance. So I think it's key. Like, I'll give you an example. Things that are so basic and require so much fight. Like, one thing that you need to do in education is to measure things. You cannot design policies if you don't measure performance, okay? Prior to Macri, the government, Cristina Fernández Kirchner's government, didn't want to participate in the PISA evaluations, like worldwide evaluations, and the unions didn't want to. So the first thing you need to do is to evaluate performance. That was a fight, and it started to happen. And then you need to implement policies, because once you solve the macro, once you stabilize, those are going to be the key discussions. You asked many questions, but I see that
No, I
just
think-
one.
Oh, that's very good. So Guido, thank you very much. I think we went a little bit over time, but you gave us, I think, a great overview of the main causes of Argentina's economic malaise and maybe some keys on how to overcome these issues that hopefully we will see them being implemented in the next few years. So thank you very much and good luck. And maybe, I mean, it took you almost 40 years to win the World Cup back. So we should not lose hope. And hopefully, I mean, we'll have you next year telling us how the first steps on this transition are working.
Thank you, Alex, for the invitation. Thank you, everyone.